Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a wonderful little box from Chandos that I really had wished I'd talked about a while ago because it's marvelous and it's lovely. It's symphonies by, Mozart and Haydn's buddies, the other classical composers. It's, 5 discs? Yeah, 5 discs of really splendid classical period works by 5 very different composers. It tells us sort of like, first of all, gives us a perspective on the classical style, which is a very helpful thing because there was more to it than Haydn, Mozart, and the young Beethoven, and different varieties of it. And you begin to hear the differences when you listen to other people, which is always a good thing to do. So there's that. And then there's the fact that this is a wonderful sampler because most of these composers now have been fairly well represented on disc. So if you hear something that you like, both on Chandos and other labels like Naxos and CPO, and they've done series of these things, you can go and follow these composers at your leisure and build out your collection of classical composers, which is a big help. And I want to talk about some of these in particular, which are really, really interesting. The composers are Krommer, Stamitz, however you want to pronounce it, Pleyel, Kozeluch, and Wranitzky. And you're not names that you really think about regularly, but they deserve to be considered because they were very talented composers. The classical period was one of those times when there were just a lot of good people around doing somewhat similar things. And so you can dip into it pretty secure in the notion that what you actually hear is going to be good quality stuff. And these are lovely performances. They're all with the London Mozart Players under Mathias Bamert. And I love this. So disc number 1 is Franz Krommer. You get his symphony in D major and his symphony in C minor. Now, Krommer is one of that huge coterie, in fact, several are on here, of Czech composers. Most of the great classical composers were not Viennese. I mean, even Mozart was from Salzburg. I mean, they were not basically Vienna-based, and they were not German. They were Czech. They were from Bohemia. It was the most wonderful musical tradition in all of Western music throughout the 18th century, and most of them are now completely ignored, largely because, as I've said before, and some of you have also mentioned, because of the fact that musicology was a largely German enterprise, and it was formed in the 19th century at the height of national imperialism, and so the composers who were elevated were necessarily the ones who were ethnically Germanic. But the great composers of the period, a lot of them were not, and they were ignored. They were completely ignored in creating this mythological history of music that ran from Bach to the Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven second Viennese school, even though they weren't Viennese so much, and but German, and then through to Brahms and Wagner. And I mean, that was sort of Schumann was in there somewhere, and Mendelssohn. I mean, that was the German story. But there's so much other terrific music that even now we're still discovering. And it's just absolutely. I mean, how many of you know the Kalevoda symphonies? He was as popular as Schumann in his day. He wrote 7 symphonies, and they're every bit as good. They're better in a lot of respects. I mean, there's just some great music out there. So this is of that type. And it's marvelous. Krommer was a Czech composer. He's famous for his wind music for wind ensembles, which is just delicious, and I've done talks on that. I did a sequel series after Haydn's Opus 33 quartets because Krommer lifted one of the slow movements and turned it into a wind piece. It's very, very funny and very, very clever. His symphonies are lovely, and they are recognizably Czech in a nationalistic sense, which is remarkable since his dates were 1759 to 1831. It was just the burgeoning, first effusion of that folk-influenced Czech nationalistic style. You hear it most powerfully in the scherzos, obviously, where he's writing dance music. But that Czech influence is really here in the music. I mean, it doesn't sound like Dvorak yet, but we're getting there. And these are lovely, lovely works. They really are. They're fun to listen to. There's a complete series of the symphonies on CPO, which at some point I will be discussing. But if you want to just dip your toe in, this inexpensive box is a great way to do it. Then we've got, let's see, Stamitz. Now, Carl Philipp Stamitz was the son of, who was it, Johann Stamitz or another Stamitz. It's a whole family of Stamitzes. They were the avatars of the Mannheim school, which had, of course, the greatest orchestra in Europe at the time, and a big orchestra, 40 some odd players or bigger, really an exciting group of people. And they were among the founders of the classical style. The orchestra was famous for, some of you know, the Mannheim crescendo. I mean, they learned to play crescendos. And because of that, and because they were so famous for doing the big orchestral crescendos, which all these composers wrote into their pieces, people have stupidly assumed that other orchestras had never figured out how to make a crescendo, which is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I mean, do you honestly think that they were going to sit there and never do it? I mean, it just comes naturally. But they wrote them down in Mannheim, and the orchestra had such precision that this is what really excited people. And the music of the Mannheim school is very, very worthwhile. And there's a whole other batch of composers. And they were Czech. They were mostly Czech, Bohemian Czech composers. So there's Stamitz. We get 3 symphonies here, I think, or 4. How many? 4. 4 symphonies. They are 3-movement works in a pre-classical style, but they're full of good music, and they're very, very well written and delightful to hear. Then we have Ignaz Pleyel, 1757 to 1831. Pleyel was actually a pupil of Haydn. He became quite famous as a concert promoter. He was running, when Haydn got to London, Pleyel was running the competing concert series. And Haydn actually stole one of Pleyel's works. He didn't even remember that he hadn't written it. It was a very interesting contretemps between them, because Haydn presented one of Pleyel's works as his own, which was, really, it's kind of shocking when you think about it. But when you write thousands and thousands of pieces, you could also understand how you might only have a dim memory of some of them, and because some things were so stylistically similar, that was always a possibility. Pleyel had a very, very big reputation in France as a music publisher, publishing things with or without permission, including some of Haydn's. And so, things were, they were just a little bit looser back then. He was famous for writing symphony concertantes. The French symphony concertant, like the Chevalier de Saint-Georges also wrote them, and the London Bach. Those are symphonic type pieces with actual instrumental solos of any indeterminate number of them. And Pleyel's works are very elegant. They are more in the, Rococo style, perhaps, than Haydn's were. But he was quite popular in his day, and the music is very highly finished. And there are 3 serious 4-movement symphonies here that are of some substance. They have slow introductions to their first movements. They have some really beautiful writing for the orchestra, and he's a composer again who's well worth getting to know. He's one of what they would call, what Robbins Landon called Haydn's seguaci, his followers, the ones who came after him and who imitated Haydn's style. And Pleyel sometimes did it so well that Haydn thought it was his style, evidently. Then we have disc 4. We have Leopold Kozeluch. He's a little earlier, 1747 to 1818. Now, Kozeluch is another one of those Czech bohemian, guys who wrote tons and tons of instrumental music. And, the Czechs were famous for their woodwind writing, as I said with Krommer, and they were absolutely fabulous masters of wind ensemble writing. That's one of the reasons we don't play them as much anymore, because we don't listen to outdoor music for wind ensemble in the way that it was ubiquitous back in the 18th century. Because even aristocrats who could not afford to have an orchestra had what they called a harmonie, which was a wind band, usually of 6 players or 8 players. They were attached to the military. They would do things, for the troops, and they would also entertain, the aristocrats outdoors in the summer in their little pavilions, or wherever they were hanging out, and they played hunting music, and they provided the house music for the time when if they didn't have a formal orchestra. So these wind players, who were often Czech and Bohemian, were running around Central Europe, and many of them were extremely fine composers, and Kozeluch was one of them. And here we have, let's see, what have we got here? 3 symphonies that are varying shapes and sizes. One of them is 3 movements, the others are 4. And they're really, really lovely works. Again, in that high classical style that Haydn, more than anybody else, really cultivated. And it was Haydn's fame and reputation that gave some of these other composers a person to emulate. And they did, and it worked well. Everyone was happy. Why not? And finally, last but not least, Paul Vranitsky. Now, Vranitsky is interesting. Vranitsky I just talked about because we just did his ballet, Das Waldmädchen on Naxos. And there is a series with Marek Stieglitz of all of his orchestral music. It's up to volume 4. But it does not have yet the work that's on here, which has been recorded many times. It's one of the great sort of singleton classic symphonies that are not by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven that you really ought to hear. And it's in this set. First, you get his D major symphony, which has a second movement called Rus, Russian. Vranitsky was getting into that wonderful ethnic, treasure trove that Haydn had actually been mining since the very start. And then the second, there's a C minor symphony, Opus 11. These are all individual works. They don't come in clumps like 6 symphonies, Opus 23 or something like that. They are standalone symphonies, which means that the symphony is gaining in importance and significance. Vranitsky's dates, by the way, were 1756 to 1808. But the big number, the big enchilada in this series, the one you really got to hear, is Opus 31. It's called the Grand Characteristic Symphony for the Peace with the French Republic. And oh, is this fun. My goodness, is this fun. This is after the peace with Napoleon and all that stuff, and the French after the Revolution, and he wrote this symphony, and it is unbelievable. It consists of the Revolution, and it's sort of like Beethoven's Wellington's Victory, only it's better. I mean, it's better music, first of all, and it's shaped into a more effective whole. You've got the Revolution, the English March, the March of the Austrians and the Prussians, and that's the first movement. Then the second movement is the Fate and Death of Louis. It's a funeral march for the King of France, the poor boy, executed by the guillotine. It's Adagio affettuoso con sordini, and then funeral march. Very gripping, but not too long. Only 5 minutes for the whole movement. 3 movements for the actual funeral, 3 minutes for the actual funeral march. So you don't say, oh God, And then we have third movement is the English March. Again, the March of the Allies. The tumult of the battle returns, and it's got some effective percussion writing that does the battle stuff successfully, some bass drum thumps and other things like that. And then finally, the prospects of peace, Andante Grazioso, and the rejoicing at the achievement of peace, an Allegro vivace conclusion. It's fun. It's fun stuff. It has been recorded several times. It's on CPO. It's not on Naxos yet, but it's here on Chandos, and there are a couple other recordings besides. There's one on Deutsche Harmonia Mundi. It's not an unknown piece to fans of the classical period and also European, military history and politics. It's one of those military symphonies that Haydn sort of invented and other people took up later. Great fun. Tremendous fun, and a wonderful way to round out this excellent collection of classical period works. So I recommend it very strongly because it really will broaden your musical horizons and give you some pathways to follow your own interests and your own curiosity. So once again, symphonies by Krommer, Stamitz, Pleyel, Kozeluch, and Wranitzky on Chandos with Matthias Bamert and the London Mozart Players on Chandos. Give it a shot and keep on listening. Take care.